території міста Харкова вилучаються безпечні залишки вибухонебезпечних предметів.
This video is from Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. What it shows are dozens of remnants from cluster munitions used by Russia in the city during its invasion of Ukraine. In the first weeks of Russia's invasion, we've seen extensive use of different types of these cluster bombs. Open source evidence examined by Newsy and our partners at Bellingcat shows that in many cases, these weapons are being used in urban or residential areas, something that may be familiar to those who watched how the Syrian civil war unfolded after Russia intervened. Finding and verifying visual evidence can reveal how these cluster munitions are being used and their impact on civilian targets in Ukraine. In fact, there are so many instances of cluster munitions being used that it's becoming difficult to keep track of it all. What we can do is confirm that they are being used and that they are hitting civilian targets.
Cluster munition is something that is a bomb or rocket or missile that contains smaller bombs inside it, submunitions. And generally they operate by opening in midair and releasing those munitions over a wide area. And that blankets the area with explosions, and it's very used for targeting, military units, for example, that might be in a field out in an open. But it may be more significant when they're being used against civilian targets.
Elliot Higgins is the founder of Bellingcat. He's also been investigating cluster bomb use in conflicts for years.
We've been able to track the use of Russian cluster munitions through the conflict in Syria. We've seen it being used in the conflict in Ukraine in 2014. But this is the first time that we're seeing it so well documented from the early days of the conflict.
Just as we've seen in Syria, Ukraine is now seeing buildings like schools, hospitals, and residential complexes become targets in these types of attacks.
At first, it did seem they were targeting places like air bases and power plants and places where there would be a kind of tactical advantage. But as the conflict has progressed, it seems to be more random, hitting civilian populations, areas where there's no obvious targets, and there's no sign of military activity in those areas either.
Cluster bombs are banned by more than 100 countries, though neither Russia nor Ukraine have signed the convention that bans their use. One early attack, just a day after Russia's invasion started, hit a kindergarten in a city in northeastern Ukraine. Videos and images from the attack showed multiple impact points where cluster bomb submunitions hit the building, and a cargo pod that carries such submunitions was found just 200 meters east of the kindergarten. And with images of that cargo pod, we can get an idea of where the rockets were fired from.
One thing that's quite distinctive about the rockets that are being used is that when they open up in the air, they split into two parts and they land rather like lawn darts. So you can actually see by looking at the impact crater which way the remains of the munition are pointing, and that often points back to the point of origin.
This attack involved what is known as a 9M27K rocket. This is just one of the cluster munitions that we've seen used in Ukraine by Russia, though.
The most common type are the type used by Smerch and Eurogan multiple rocket launchers, and we've seen these all over Ukraine so far, including the city of Kharkiv, where they've been used a great deal to the point where there's piles of the remains of them being gathered. We're also seeing the use of long-range ballistic missiles carrying cluster munitions, and we've seen one example so far of an unguided cluster munition bomb, an RBK-500, being used. What we're seeing as well with these cluster munitions is some of them are unique to the Russian military. So, for example, there's the 9M54 guided missile that's being used at the moment. And that's actually a radar guided missile, and that's a lot more accurate. So you have something called the circular area of probability, which is the area where there's a 50% chance that the missile or rocket will hit. Now, with these earlier models, that's about 150 meters. So that's quite a large area. With the newer models, you're looking at 7 to 15 meters. And this is significant because we're seeing these in civilian areas where there's no apparent military presence, there's no military targets. So it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that they are targeting these civilian areas.
Cluster munitions have real long-term consequences beyond the immediate, indiscriminate damage they cause. That's because they remain a threat to civilians in the area for years after their use due to dud submunitions not exploding.
We've seen from previous conflicts, going back to Vietnam, for example, that there can be decades of a legacy from the use of cluster munitions, of people uncovering them, children picking them up, not realizing what they are. And these things can still be dangerous for years, even decades after they've been used. So they could land in a field and be buried in the mud, and a farmer plows them up and they explode and they kill the farmer. So the widespread use of cluster munitions, particularly in civilian areas, presents not only an immediate risk, but also a long-term risk to the local people.
There are likely to be thousands of unexploded submunitions left in Ukraine. However this war ends, they will cause lasting hazards to civilians who continue to suffer.